In March and April 2017, Lindsay and I did a working holiday to Florence in Italy. Working for me, holiday for Lindsay. You know how it goes. This was before kids, so we just locked up the house for 2 months, turned the heating down, booked an Airbnb in Florence, made loose plans, and just decided to go over. And yeah, we spent the first few weeks being on holiday, doing all the tourist stuff in Florence, getting the bus up to Fiesole, watching Fiorentina play. All of the dreams come true, really. We also did language school. We did 3 weeks of language school to attempt to grasp the basics of Italian, which, knowing a bit of Spanish and having done some travelling in South America, is eternally confusing. I was trying to squish all of the Spanish in my brain into a tiny box that was locked away in the corner of my mind. And we did some nice trips. We went out to Bologna. We got the train to Siena. We spent some time with some friends that we made at language school who were also staying in Florence and had accidentally hired a castle. So we went and hung out at their castle while they made food. And to external appearances, everything was happy, everything was dandy, but work wasn't going very well. And people would ask me, "Oh, so you run your own business? What do you do?" And I was still in that phase of saying, what would you like to hear about? I was still part AdWords guy, part CRM guy. I was leaning more into storytelling at that point. I still had Gary Vaynerchuk's words ringing in my ears from the Icon conference of pick one thing and start winning. But I'd struggled to put it into practice. I was leaning more into the storytelling work, but I hadn't really found a way to make it work commercially at that point. So people would still ask me what I did, and I'd have to be. It made me feel quite awkward inside. So we got back from Florence. Things were still not going very well. I was now in quite a lot of debt. I was in fairly substantially into my overdraft. And we had that talk. You know that talk where your spouse is like, "Okay, this is not making you well. I think it's time to get a job for a bit. I think it's time to let go." So we had that talk, and I was like, okay, I can see that I'm not very well. Towards the end of my time in Florence, I'd started picking up like a breathing shortage. I was struggling. I was almost gasping for air at times. And Lindsay's a much better judge of these things than I am sometimes, and she was like, "Look, it's time. It's time." So I was like, okay. So I spruced up my CV and started to put it out there. One of the first things that came back was an inquiry from a recruiter on LinkedIn. I nearly always ignored recruiters on LinkedIn. This time, I decided to respond to her message. She had a client fairly close to me who was looking for someone to manage their Infusionsoft accounts and be their in-house marketing guy and database manager. And you might remember from last week's episode that I was an Infusionsoft certified partner. I'd gone down that road. I'd spent time at Infusionsoft HQ in Arizona. I was like, oh man, this seems perfect. What's the downside? So I applied. I went to the job interview. The job interview went well. It was very serious. Everyone was wearing suits and so on. And they said a few things in the interview that kind of set a few red warning bells going. They said, we like to work hard and play hard. Is that okay? I was like, yeah, I think that's okay. I think everyone says that, don't they? That we like to work hard and play hard. We like to hustle and so on. But it just set a little red warning bell. I was like, okay, what they're really saying is, we like to hustle. Do you like to hustle? I picked up on that signal. They also said, Jim here, and I've changed all names in this story. Jim here was emailing me at 10 p.m. last night about something. If I sent you an email at 10 p.m, is it the kind of thing that you might see, that you might respond to? And every cell in my body was like, no. I would have turned my laptop off. I would have gone to bed. I would not be responding to you crazy people. But, things were pretty desperate. It looked like a really good opportunity. I figured, maybe they're not as crazy as they seem. So I said, yeah, sure. I'll respond at 10 p.m. Yeah, sure. So I walked out to the interview, and anyway, I got the job. And I'm there on the first day. I'm there with my new boss. And we're mapping out everything. And, things go really well for a while. In a sense, the job is kind of made for me. I've got almost a blank slate with the Infusionsoft accounts. I can start from scratch. The website needed setting up, or the website needed desperately redoing. So they're like, you know what, just create a new one from scratch, do it as you want, create the pages that you want, get the content that you want. If you need any help, we will fund marketing agencies to help you. There was no ad strategy, so we created the ad strategy across Google, Meta, LinkedIn. We even tried Twitter ads at the time. So in some regards, it was the perfect job. It pulled together a lot of my skills. I also went through what I now call the story jumpstart process with the business owner, who was the voice of the business. And he went through and he told me all of these stories about his life. And we put those stories front and centre in the first Infusionsoft sequence that went out when people opted in. And I later met a few of our clients who said, you know what, the best emails, because we used to send a lot of emails, the best emails that you sent out were those ones that where so-and-so was just telling stories about how he got into this thing. It's like, yeah, I wrote those. So things went well for a few months. I had the sense that I was constantly chasing my tail. We're always trying to spin 7 different plates at once. Jim, who had asked me in the initial interview if I was okay responding to emails at 10 p.m, turned out to then be my line manager, who was fine at times, but he used to really put the screws on me. And we were under a lot of pressure. We were under a lot of pressure to perform. We were under a lot of pressure to keep the plate spinning. Jim was very good actually at keeping the plate spinning and having these crazy project management spreadsheets of working out what needed to be done when, what communications needed to go out on what days. So we had all of these plates spinning. Towards the end of September, we put on a 2-day live event for all of our customer base and anyone else who wanted to show up. It was 2 days on site with an evening out, with a black tie dinner. Mine and Jim's job was to get people to this event. And we left it quite late because we were trying to do 17 other things. We were trying to run webinars every week. We were trying to run other live events that we still had to promote besides the main live events that we were trying to attract people to. And we were cutting it pretty fine. We got down to, a few days before, we were still there creating press releases. We even created a radio ad. About 3 days before the event, Jim came in and said, look, we're going to do a radio ad. I know you've never written a press release before, but I need you to write a press release. I also need you urgently by 10 a.m. to write a script for a radio ad that's going to go out on local radio tomorrow. We've got the voice talent lined up. It's all ready. It needs you, Rob. It needs you to do the script now, as well as keep these other 7 plates spinning. Because if all the plates fall on the floor, the world's going to end. So, in some regards, it was fun. But it was a lot of pressure. We did manage to make the event work. We did manage to get everyone to show up. I don't think the local radio ad worked, but we did do it. We did get it sent out. So my script was there on local radio. As the months ticked by, Jim fell out with the company management and was removed from the company, essentially. And I had a chat with the big boss who said, would you like to step up and become our head of marketing? And she sold me the dream, it'll be your department, you can grow it any way you like, we'll bring on staff. And there's I knew it was a trap. Not deliberately a trap, but for me I knew it wasn't really for me. But it was a bit more money, it was the obvious next step. It was easier to say yes to it than say no to it. And again, I figured, perhaps it'll be all right. Perhaps it'll be all right when I get into it. Perhaps they will stop being crazy. Have you ever worked for a boss where they stop being crazy? So I got into this head of marketing role. I kind of fudged it for a bit. I'm a good copywriter, I'm a good storyteller, fairly average marketing manager, if truth be told. But I was keeping the plate spinning. I now not had I didn't have 7 plates to spin. I now had about 15 plates to spin, and these plates are spinning faster and faster and faster. When I got back after the Christmas break in January, I was told that we had one main flagship product, and I was told that we were now going to launch 8 more products that were also going to become flagship products that would need the same level of marketing, the same webinar strategies, the same live event strategies. And they decided that they wanted to go from running one webinar a week, which is borderline killing me with tension. We'd have to get sort of 400 or 500 people on a live webinar every week just to keep the wheel turning. So we were now not going to run one webinar a week. We were going to run 5 or 6, sometimes even 7. All of these webinars needed emails going out, multiple emails going out, reminders on the day, follow-ups afterwards. Each webinar would usually need a sales page, an upsell. All of these things needed checking. Most of the webinars were run in the evening at about 8 p.m. Let me tell you, that January was a dark month. There was one evening when I was still at the office. Lindsay at the time was 7 months or so pregnant with Hugo. It's the closest I've ever come to sleeping in the office. I can probably say, actually, if Lindsay wasn't pregnant, I probably would have just hunkered down under my desk and got some sleep for a few hours and then got back to it. Eventually, the plates did start to drop. To begin with, I actually missed a webinar. I forgot that one of the 5 or 6 webinars that we were doing every week, I forgot about one of them. I forgot to do all of the assets for it, to schedule the promotion. I had a very frank chat with my boss, who was like, "Are you sure you're cut out for this, Rob?" And externally, I said, yes. And internally, I said, no. No, I don't think I am. You lot are crazy. In February, my son Hugo was born premature. He was born at 34 weeks, which isn't extremely premature by premature baby standards, but we still had a brand new premature baby in hospital. He was in hospital for 3 weeks or so. So Lindsay was in hospital with him. I was at home having the screws put on me about running webinars every night of the week. And then in the evening, I'd go to hospital. I'd go and cuddle Hugo, spend time with Lindsay, have skin-to-skin time with Hugo. Often I'd stay the night in the hospital. They had a little camp bed that they could put out. Didn't get any sleep in the hospital. We used to have to wake up every 3 hours. So he had a because he was very small, he had a nasogastric tube going up his nose, down into his stomach. So we had to wake up every 3 hours to do a feed, check his nappy, possibly change his nappy if he'd done a nappy escaping poo, clean up the poo if it had escaped. Lindsay was also trying to breastfeed, so she had the breast pumps out. If you've never heard the sound of an electric breast pump, they kind of it's like a human milking machine, and they go. So I stayed overnight in the hospital quite a lot. Didn't get any sleep. I was changing nappies. I was listening to the milking process. I was feeding Hugo, which involved hoping that he didn't throw up and watching this syringe of freshly milked milk drip slowly down a syringe through the nasogastric tube into his stomach. So I was doing all of that at night. I remember one morning it was snowing and I trudged home for my appraisal with my boss. And by this point, all of the plates had fully fallen on the floor. I'd completely lost the thread of what I was doing. I remember actually going to work one day and hearing someone cry in the toilets. I was like, "Who's that crying in the toilets?" And my colleague said, "Oh, it's so-and-so. Don't worry, she always cries in the toilets." I'm not really a cry in the toilets kind of guy, but I remember having one day where I think I broke down at work. I remember sitting there, staring blankly at my desk. All of the items that I had to do, all of the pressure, everything, I just went completely numb, completely blank. I may have cried a bit, with a little tear I'm not a crying guy, but I may have had a little tear. I closed my laptop at about 1:30 in the afternoon, and I went home and just decided I'm just going to go home. I don't care. I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm just going to let the chips fall where they land. So that had happened the week before, and now a week later, I've spent the night in hospital with my premature baby and my wife, trying to hold things together. I trudge back in the snow from my appraisal with my crazy boss, who's like, I don't get it, Rob. I don't understand why all the plates are falling on the floor. And again, I didn't have anything to say to her. Not long after that, I ran my first live event, my own event, called the Big Story Workshop. I put a lot of work into the Big Story Workshop, and I managed to convince 3 students to travel to Sheffield and spend 3 days with me, exploring their story, documenting their story, converting what they told me into draft output. It was really a prototype for an event that I plan to run again in the future. It was much more than an event. In the evening, I gave them my pie, peas and beer tour of Sheffield. So it was a full experience. I was quite tired after running this event for 3 days. It was a full-on 3 days. But I remember the day after my event finished, I was walking back to the Jessops Wing Hospital, which is where Hugo and Lindsay still were. And I didn't feel 1% tired. I felt completely elated on the inside. I felt like, with absolute certainty, that all of the shit that was going on at work couldn't touch me. I felt like I was on the right path. I felt like I was walking on air, honestly. And I realised on that walk to the hospital that running live events like that, helping people to explore and extract, document and share their story is really the work that I'm here to do. Today's core story prompt is the third of our core story prompts, and it's all about self-understanding. The story that I've just told you is an 11th hour switch out, I have to confess. When I originally planned this episode, and actually when I originally created the email sequence that preceded this podcast sequence, I told a different story to illustrate self-understanding. I've changed it for the work story and me breaking down at work, and around the time that my son Hugo was born. I've switched in that story, and there's a few reasons why, and we'll get into it in this episode. But the self-understanding story, if you're following along with the hero's journey story structure, the first of our core story prompts was in the hero's journey terms, it gets called the call. So that was the wounding event. That was the starting point in your journey of life events that have set you on the path to where you are today. On the last episode, we were talking about the false start story, where you make a bit of progress, but you're not acting as your real, true, authentic self yet, because you don't have this level of self-understanding. Today's prompt about self-understanding is really the culmination of those false start iterations. And I realised actually in preparing this episode that the story that I previously had planned to tell in this slot was really another false start story. And actually the true self-understanding story was the story that I told you about breaking down at work. So we'll get into that in this episode. As always, there's 3 ideas to chew over. The first idea is the breakdown. The second idea is conflict. And the third idea is internal knowing. So let's go ahead and have a look at the first idea. The key reason why I've switched out the story for this episode was because in storytelling terms, the self-understanding story is really the breaking point. It's the breaking point event where the character in some regards breaks down. They've been trying to succeed in their goal in the story by acting in a certain way. And it isn't working. And those are the false start iterations. Self-understanding then is the point at which it snaps. It's the point at which all of the pressure becomes too much. I've come to think that we have breakdowns in life for a reason. I've come to believe that breakdowns are actually an essential part of the journey of being human and growing as a person. I always thought, and again, this was a product of my grammar school education, I always thought that breakdowns kind of applied to other people. I had this kind of stoic, grumpy, crusty exterior that I present to the world, and that is to a large extent me. I'm fairly unflappable, but I never thought I would break down. I thought that breakdowns happen to other people. I thought I could deal with the pressure, and it turns out that if you keep adding more pressure and keep asking me to do something that isn't in my genius zone, then eventually, like everyone else in the world, I do crack. So I mentioned the girl crying in the toilets in the story, but that was really to contrast that against my own, what I regard as my own breakdown, which is where I just closed up at work. I just closed my laptop. I shed a small tear. My mind, I remember just feeling numb, felt completely numb, and I just went home. Like, I was okay. I was on the motorbike, so I was okay to ride home. I wasn't I wasn't a puddle on the floor. That isn't really my style. But I knew that a break had happened. I knew that the message from the universe was, you cannot continue on this path. You have to find a way to make a change. So that's the first element of the self-understanding prompt. It's thinking about a time where you have had some kind of breakdown. This could be a variety of things. It could be, I think when we think about breakdowns, we often think of breakdowns as a result of some kind of toxic relationship that has driven us to this point. I've never really been in that kind of toxic relationship. I've only ever been married once, and I'm still currently happily married. That's what we tend to think about. So I think it's easy to assume, if you've not been through that multiple marriage cycle, that this doesn't apply to you, and it does. It does. It just means that the breakdown shows up in your life in a different way. Usually you have someone close to you, hopefully, unless you're doing this all by yourself and you just don't have anyone in your inner circle. Usually when the breakdown happens, someone in your inner circle will take you to one side, and this could be your spouse, but it could be a parent, it could be a very close friend. Someone will take you to one side and say, look now, it's time to consider a different path. So think about, in selecting the story to illustrate your crux development and self-understanding, you need to think about, well, is there elements of personal breakdown in the story? Because you only grow as a person. It's like you have to be cracked open in order for the light to be let in order for you to see what your true genius is, so that you can determine a new path forwards. The second idea to discuss is conflict. So another element of your self-understanding story. So again, comparing this to literature, in literature, or in the movies, which is still literature, you would have baddies, you'd have dark characters, you would have dark characters putting pressure on the hero or protagonist of the story. And you need an element of that. And I'm not saying that the people in my story were baddies or dark characters or evil or necessarily out to get me, but there were antagonists in the story who were there putting pressure on me in order to achieve their own aims and objectives. I've tried to anonymise the story quite carefully in the telling of it, and I want to, because the thing about podcasting is, like, you never really know who's following along and listening. And anyone who did work with me from that time will recognise the company that I'm talking about. And I want to make it very clear that I think I manifested the situation. I assign no blame to anyone that I was working with. The way things panned out were fully on me, and I think that everything that shows up in your life, I used to think that things just showed up randomly, but it sure feels like there's a lot of coincidences in life. So I've come to believe that I manifested that situation. And I also believe it was a gift. It was a gift that has allowed me to see truly inside myself as to who I was and what change I wanted to make. And in that regard, it was a gift. And I find myself saying the Hawaiian Ho'oponopono, where you say to these people, you say, thank you, please forgive me, I love you. And I think that's a really good thing to stand by. So having said all that, coming back to the second idea, which is conflict, the point I'm trying to make is that the antagonists in your story who are creating this conflict are not going to be the baddies that you get in movies. In real life, characters are not black and white. Heroes are not all good. Baddies are not all bad. Everyone is great. And actually, great stories, the hero or the heroes and the antagonists will have good and bad elements. But you need to make sure that there's some conflict in your story. So the conflict in my story was firstly where I missed a webinar and I had my boss saying, are you sure you're cut out for this, Rob? And then also in my appraisal conversation where my boss was like, I don't get it. I don't understand. So the conflict doesn't have to be fisticuffs. It doesn't have to be screaming and yelling, but there needs to be someone in the story putting pressure on you and at least in an emotional sense, causing conflict. Third idea I want to share with you, and almost the ending point of the self-understanding story, is internal knowing. And finishing the story on what should usually be an up or a good thing. So in my story, I finished on me telling you about me running the Big Story workshop and having 3 people come to Sheffield and spend 3 days with me to explore and document and share their story. And I told you about the feeling afterwards where the day after the event, I still had all of this shit going on. I was trudging up to the hospital in the snow, and I felt like I was walking on air, like I was on the right path. I had this internal knowing of like, this is the right path. I don't know how to make it work yet, but I knew it's the most clear signal I've had. I'm not a conventionally religious person. I'm increasingly, I think, a spiritual woo-woo person. But it's the clearest evidence to me that if there is an all-knowing universe, that I was sent a message at that point to say, you're doing all right. This is the path forwards. Because I know that because I felt it. It was a feeling, not a thought. It was a feeling that I was on the right path. There's going to be trauma in your self-understanding story. I want you to think about a breakdown. I want you to think about conflict. I want you to think about antagonists who are applying conflict to you. But then the self-realization comes from this internal knowing of feeling the right path forwards. So you need to figure out what that path is. For me, it was walking to hospital and feeling like nothing could touch me, like I was walking on air. So what was that feeling for you? We're at the end of this episode. Let's do a bit of a recap. Today's episode has explored the third of my core story prompts, which is the self-understanding prompt, which you might consider as the moments of truth. It's where, in storytelling terms, it's where the pressure on you as the hero is at its highest. It causes you, in some regards, to break or break down, and that breakdown facilitates a vision of the true work that you're here to do. It's almost like the crux of the story, because after this point, we're really rolling into the solution and the vision forwards. So this is really perhaps in many regards, it's the darkest point in the story. It's where the pressure on you is the highest. It's where the stakes on you are the highest. I've talked a lot in the story about me having the plate spinning around. So the stakes are high at this point. So the three story elements we've discussed are firstly the breakdown. That there should be a breakdown. It doesn't have to be you sobbing in the toilets, but you need to have some kind of breakdown. There needs to be conflict put on you by antagonists in the story that raise the stakes, that create this pressure on you, because without the pressure, nobody changes without pressure. It's a bit like rock formation. Rocks do not form without pressure on top of them. It's the same. The third idea was internal knowing, was then coming round to the realization, seeing this self-understanding key, understanding truly what your genius zone is and what work you're here to do, and feeling that and describing where you were when you had that feeling. What else is going on in my world? One of the podcasts that I run is Sovereign Finance, which I run with a friend called Derek Dearden. We've been running the podcast for a couple of years. I'm actually having a play around with buying some Bitcoin at the moment. So I've come to realise that the world financial system is, perhaps the biggest, the biggest elephant in the room, the most fucked up thing, the thing that has been hijacked perhaps for hundreds, if not thousands of years, as we've got this debt-based Ponzi scheme that we pass off as currency. So I've become very interested in it, which is a big surprise to me, given that money is not really one of my motivations. But I've become very interested in the systems around money. So I've been looking at buying some Bitcoin, not for an investment. I'm not speculating on Bitcoin. I'm just looking at it as like, is it a possible way that we can maintain sovereignty, trade with each other on our own terms, and ultimately, if shit hits the fan, work around the system. So I'm having a bit of a play around with buying some Bitcoin on a peer-to-peer basis, trying to avoid the main big coin exchanges, and looking at some self-custody hardware wallets. So again, if all of that sounds interesting, you should sign up for our Sovereign Finance podcast at sovereignfinance.substack.com. Link in the show notes. So that's what I'm up to at the moment. On next week's episode, we'll move on and have a look at the fourth core story prompt, which sounds similar to self-understanding, but it's what I call the key insight. The key insight is more of a market insight. It's less of an internal insight and more of an external insight, where you start to piece the puzzles together. So you've had this self-understanding. The key insight is then seeing how it fits in with the marketplace and what people need. So we'll talk about that next time. If you found this episode of Story Systems helpful, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. I'll send you a copy of my lead incubator system blueprint and also my top 5 core story prompts for entrepreneurs. Head to storyrob.com/podcast. You can also find my book by searching on Amazon for Simple Story Selling. See you next time.